Again, folks, if you're clicking on this call and it's Tuesday, January 20th at 9:30, you're here to discuss e-mobility. I'm Kevin Burns, the mayor of Geneva, Illinois, and chairperson of the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment and Energy Committee. And it's my pleasure to host this morning's discussion. As all of us know, e-mobility refers to transportation by a wide range of vehicles powered by electricity. In our region, the greater Chicagoland region, electric power is a cleaner source of transportation than, of course, other sources. And we believe that e-mobilities are a convincing benefit to a lot of people. Technological advances have allowed small, affordable vehicles like e-bikes and others to be taken by internal combustion engines in a far more efficient way. And this brings further benefit and access to transportation opportunities for many people. The widespread use is, however, as all of us will agree, causing some conflicts and significant safety and regulatory challenges for municipalities. Solutions will likely require state and local governments to adapt regulations and possibly new laws governing these vehicles. This is, to say the least, a hot topic on this cold morning. We are fortunate to have with us experts in the area of e-mobility and emerging regulations. And before we begin introducing our first speaker, let's get a quick baseline on where your jurisdiction is relative to e-mobility regulations. We've got a quick Zoom poll. There it is, folks. Does your local government have any e-mobility device regulations in place? Geneva does not, by the way. That's a quick question. That's good. I trust everyone's had a chance to fill that out. Okay. Simple question to kick things off, and that's good. And now let's, check it out, folks. 59% do not. Interesting. And of course, there's already a couple questions popping up in the chat, which is good. We appreciate that. Our first speaker is our good friend Dave Simmons this morning. Dave is the executive director of Ride Illinois and an expert on the topic of e-mobility. Ride Illinois is the state's nonprofit grassroots bicycle advocacy organization with a mission to make Illinois better through biking. Dave has been in this role since 2019 after a previous career in educational publishing and assessment. And here's we call these fun facts, but this is I think a very moving fact about my good friend Dave. Dave biked to Door County, Wisconsin from his home here in Illinois with his parents' ashes to fulfill their last wish to be scattered in a place that they love to visit. Isn't that something? Amazing. I got to find out how long this took Dave to go up there. So we're going to talk about e-mobility, the positive aspects of sensible regulation. Mr. Simmons, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mayor Burns. I appreciate that. And
how long did it take you to drive to?
It was about 4 days of biking, affectionately called hauling ash. You know, we're a pretty snarky family, so we
Thank God we're
put a positive spin on it.
Got that, folks?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for this this opportunity today. Let me start my timer so I stay on time. Yeah, we're going to talk about micromobility, e-mobility, personal mobility. It has lots of names. It's ever evolving. And I was asked to speak about the benefits of sensible regulation, which is the space Ride Illinois has been in for much of 2025 as we lead into 2026. A few bullet points of things we're going to touch on today, and I believe the slides will be shared afterwards for those if you don't get a chance to read the information. And quickly about me, as Mayor Burns stated, I'm Executive Director of Ride Illinois. We are the state's nonprofit bicycle advocacy organization. Thank you for all who are here today. I appreciate you being here. And then just a little bit about Ride Illinois, if you're not familiar. Um, Mayor Burns mentioned the mission, and we focus on several areas. I think one of the bullet points I'd want to call out here, and I thought about changing the statement is, but making a bicycle an everyday option for personal mobility, but could also argue, other devices. So that's a bit about Ride Illinois. We're a small and mighty team with my colleagues listed here. But what I'd like to do first is kind of set the tone. And I feel like this is probably a pervasive tone for most folks on this call. But when we talk about micromobility and e-mobility, it's not all doom and gloom, right? There's opportunity here. So I'd love for you to kind of be in that mindset as we jump into some discussion points today. You've probably seen variations of this type of graphic, on social media or other places, how cars, EVs, hydrogen cars, you name it, come with a lot of the same baggage, as if you will, as internal combustion engines. So I added the little micromobility mention on top of there. But when we're talking about personal mobility or one person, one device, it takes up a lot less space on the road. So let's talk about micromobility and personal mobility. But I wanted to start with some facts and figures, and I did just update these. These are from a presentation we did earlier in the summer, but you look at the leftmost column of the cost of cars. I got two kids in their mid-20s. That's a scary figure. Not only the cost of new and used cars, but also what it costs to own and maintain a vehicle, like almost $1,000 a month. The new modes, the reason we're here today, they're here. They're popular, they're sustainable, practical, like all the things that I imagine this committee discusses quite a bit. And it also reduces the transportation costs for individuals. If you're an elected official, that can be an appealing option, and they're less polluting. And then over the years, we look back to the 80s when about 80% of 18-year-olds had driver's licenses, and now the figures are close to about 60%. There's just less interest in driving. And some of the reasons listed or that were given are listed there. One of them being there are other options. So folks are looking for other options. So we'll talk about quick overview of micromobility and personal mobility, just to give some examples to folks that may not be aware. And a bicycle is a great example of personal mobility, right? Including bike share, which kind of ebbs and flows over the years, but is super popular, especially in Chicago. The Segway, I could tell a story about my dad who said, "Oh, I drove this thing, and we're never going to walk anywhere again." Eh, I don't think it quite hit that. And then e-scooters or regular scooters, right? Those are popular as well. Just a few of the devices that you're probably familiar with, and then some new examples. I will freely admit, the first two, one wheels and e-skateboards, I wouldn't go 10 feet without crashing, right? It's definitely an acquired skill, but people use them, and they have ranges up to 20, 30 miles an hour on a charge. And are relatively inexpensive. We at Ride Illinois, we talk about quality products. We want people buying quality bikes because we know they're going to last longer. So I did a little bit of poking around, and one wheel, a good one, the quality one's about $750. An e-skateboard, $300. E-motos, which has kind of really been the focus for the going on a year now. They're cheap. They're cheap, but those are the devices that kind of give us the greatest pause. They have the range, which is great. They allow people to get places without driving, but it's the speed. And here's an example of just one that states, go 36 miles an hour. Those are some of the concerns that, we're all trying to address. We recently found out about this little guy. It's a spinoff of Rivian called the Also Quad. And it looks so cute, and it can haul stuff. And it's a class 1 e-bike. underneath. One of the concerns that we share is that on the also quad page, they show this little guy riding in the bike lanes. And in urban areas, bike lanes are getting um, rather crowded. So have to figure out where all of these devices belong and how they can kind of coexist with other vehicles. We'll touch just a little bit on relevant laws. These are statutes that are already in place, starting with low-speed e-bikes. The three-class system, you've probably heard of it referred to as that. 45 states have adopted this three-class system. The classes differ between maximum speed and then whether or not one has to pedal. And I like this little graphic because it gives a nice summary of the three classes and really how they differ. So you'll note the class 2 does have a throttle, and it does allow the user to move without pedaling, which is beneficial for folks who have limited mobility. Kind of leave it at that. And next, just a few other notes about low-speed e-bikes and the law that currently exists. They have to have a sticker. Can't be operated on sidewalks. As we've certainly learned this year, deciding where they can be used for home rule communities, they can decide on do they belong on paths and infrastructure, an age requirement, and a non-tampering requirement. Right, Illinois, we feel that the existing law is sufficient for low-speed e-bikes. Scooters, in 2024, I believe it was, a bill was passed about low-speed e-scooters, and it has all these characteristics: maximum speed, one user at a time, an age requirement of 18. We are talking about a maximum speed in this case, and a legal definition of 10 miles an hour. Of course, we know there are lots of other devices, lots of other scooters that can go faster. So there are efforts underway. I know it's discussed in Northwest Municipal Conference. I'm sure Eric and Brian will touch on it. Also in other conversations and working groups we've been part of to establish another class of scooters. So it's not overly restrictive when we're talking about low-speed scooters. I want to focus just a few moments on what we call the rise of e-motos. Mayor Burns, I'm going to use the cicada reference. So it seemingly in summer of 2025, e-motos just kind of popped up out of the ground. And we saw mostly teens, mostly boys riding these little mini motorcycles everywhere. And it's certainly a concern. So hopefully we can push the cicadas back under the ground. So what are e-motos? Ride Illinois chose to use that term because it was developed by People for Bikes, and it kind of has a national understanding, if you will. When we talk to peer organizations, we're referring to e-motos. When we talked about legislation, we're talking about e-motos, but it's had a couple other names. Certainly, industry has been moving real quick. There's manufacturers who are just looking to make a quick buck. So they're putting out these inexpensive, poorly made, or not quality products that can go really fast, but they look like bikes. And they have motors greater than 750 watts, which is the equivalent of 1 horsepower. So because they're marketed to teens and because they really kind of popped up overnight, there's need for some regulation. So the safety concerns are there. We also talk to folks who encounter users on trails, who encounter users in bike lanes. What are these things? Let's figure this out. There's definitely confusion. The public is very confused. The media is certainly culpable because they call everything an e-bike, even though many of the instances that and discussions we've had have not been about e-bikes themselves. My cat says hello. Retailers, I mentioned already, there has to be efforts to rein them in. And quite honestly, people are just seeing things online typically that are this amazing deal that they can't pass up. And they don't even know. They're not intentionally oftentimes purchasing an e-moto, to get away with something. One of our main concerns is the municipal ordinances that have overreached and are creeping into legal e-bikes and restricting the use of e-bikes. I'm sure, again, Eric and Brian will touch on this. They've got some great maps, but there has been this flurry of ordinances in suburban Chicagoland. Another reference, we refer to the Asian carp. We're trying to keep these ordinances to the bird so we can sort it out with, the royal we before downstate communities, and solve it for downstate communities, to be quite honest. I mentioned the public's confusion, the crackdown on legal e-bikes, and really one of the main points we want folks to take away today is the e-moto. Focusing on the e-motos is going to address most of the issues that you're seeing in your community, and this is based on many conversations with municipalities, with municipal staff, etc. We have a fun little chart, and I feel like every presentation's got to have a QR code. So you may have found the Ride Illinois page where we offered some guidance, some sensible guidance to municipalities that were passing ordinances. Just wanted to, want to make sure we're thinking things through because we know folks, people are writing these things and they're finding ways to get around because they're cheaper and more practical. So just a few notes on how, and these are conversations we've had with many folks now, but a few things that Ride Illinois has identified as far as how do we integrate these new mobility modes? We don't want bans, we don't want heavy-handed. How do we work together to integrate these modes? Because they're not going anywhere. One of which is going to be it's already been touched on, and again, Eric and Brian will touch on, but updating the Illinois Vehicle Code so they don't fall into a gray area. There's going to be, we know of at least 3 bills that have been introduced already for the spring session that are going to discuss this, and they all kind of take a different approach. Likely will require driver's licenses and registration for e-motos, for example. We feel that if a state law is passed, let's say when, because we do think it's going to happen, it would be prudent for municipalities to then go back and review if they had passed an ordinance. Well, how does the state law help us? Should we revise our ordinance to align with state law? Because part of the challenge is the variability from community to community. I mentioned the reining in retailers. This is not just an Illinois issue. We talked to peer orgs across the country, orgs at the federal level. They're all trying to figure this out. The internet and online retail being what it is, it's pretty challenging. There are some examples. We can look at other states and what they've done to kind of stem the tide, some of which is included in some of the draft bills that have been introduced. And then lastly, there is a place for education. Strengthening the law that was passed in 2018, that was the Bike Walk Education Act, including content about e-devices would certainly be valuable. We talk, and admittedly, we're an advocacy or we're trying to push the envelope, but we talk about, well, what if in schools we weren't just teaching driver's ed, we were teaching mobility ed. We're teaching kids and teens how to bike and walk and drive. So it's not really a one-sided or like a binary choice. With that, we know it's going to take some time. We do think it's more of generational behavior change, not an overnight change. So as you hear about efforts focused on education, we'd certainly appreciate support and criticism. Well, let's figure it out. And then just a few final thoughts. We're really planning for the future. There are many folks who would say we've passed peak car with the availability of all these new ways to get around. Cars and trucks as we know it are not, well, I should say, sales are declining and the interest in all these other devices is skyrocketing. So the demand is here. We need to figure out from a legal standpoint, where do these things belong? But we also need to be talking about infrastructure and how to develop infrastructure that accommodates these devices. So we talk about thoughtful, balanced, common sense, integrating these modes into transportation. And advocacy orgs can certainly be your partner. We'll assist certainly to the best of our ability. And lastly, just a few parting thoughts. This is if you're on social media, check out Rovello Creative. Tom Flood was the keynote speaker at our Bike and Walk Summit earlier. Well, I guess it was last year now. Just to give you some, kind of pause and think about, the infrastructure that we have and really the impact of a car-dominated society. We can do better. We should do better. And conversations like this is a great way to get folks thinking differently about ways we move about our community. Lastly, I'll drop in my contact information. If you have questions, want to do a follow-up conversation, we're happy to do so. Again, thank you, Mayor Burns and Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. We appreciate the spotlight on this topic. And I don't know if I'm passing it back to Mayor Burns or to Edith, but appreciate your time.
Mayor Burns, you muted.
Well, thank God. Hey, a quick question for you, man. You referenced states trying to address this issue. What state do you believe is the most aggressive with respect to addressing?
Yeah. Minnesota has done a really nice job. They've approached it from an education standpoint. They've also been kind of on the forefront of like, we know these things aren't e-bikes, but what are they? So let's have a conversation. So, and it's also a good reference because they're a Midwest state, right?
Sure.
I think that's helpful.
Edith or Cheryl, anything else we should address right away?
No questions immediately in the chat, and we're on time. So thank you, Dave. I know.
Well, without delay, our next two speakers are attorneys who bring legal expertise to today's conversation. Our friend Eugene Bolotnikov is a local government associate at Ansel Glink, who advises local governments about FOIA, the Open Meetings Act, contract, property, and land use matters. Eugene has previously presented on and published matters relating to low-speed electric bicycles and low-speed electric scooters and their impacts on local governments. Our friend Tyler Smith advises municipalities on corporate zoning, election law, and labor and employment matters. Before joining Ansel Glink, Tyler served as a law clerk for the Wisconsin Elections Commission and as a law clerk for the Illinois Commerce Commission and as a policy advisor for Denton's law firm. So we have two distinguished attorneys talking to us this morning regarding the regulatory landscape for low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters. And you gentlemen have 6 hours to describe all this.
I think that'll be more than sufficient, Mayor. Thank you. I appreciate the rousing introduction.
Of course, I had to make it all up.
So thank you for attending today, everybody. Just some quick thoughts. I'll be discussing low-speed e-bikes, and my colleague Tyler will be discussing low-speed e-scooters later throughout the presentation. The objectives of this presentation are threefold. First, we intend to analyze the legal authority to regulate low-speed e-bikes and low-speed e-scooters on roads and other property and within units of local government. Secondly, we plan to examine the regulatory options for e-bikes and e-scooters that our local communities have. And third, we'll briefly touch upon some of the liability considerations regarding e-bike and e-scooter regulations in communities. With respect to low-speed electric bicycle classifications, my colleague Dave briefly alluded to this earlier throughout the presentation, but there are three classifications. There's a state law citation. Class 1 pertains to low-speed electric bicycles that are equipped with a motor that provides assistance only when the rider is actively pedaling and ceases to provide assistance when the bike reaches a speed of 20 miles an hour. Class 2 low-speed e-bicycles are those that are equipped with a motor that may be used exclusively to propel the e-bike and that is not capable of providing assistance when the e-bike reaches a speed of 20 miles an hour. And Class 3 low-speed e-bikes are those equipped with a motor that provides assistance only when the rider is pedaling and ceases providing assistance when the bike reaches a speed of 28 miles an hour. Therefore, a little bit different than Class 1 and Class 2. In terms of the state law framework currently for low-speed electric bicycles, the Illinois Vehicle Code generally authorizes operating low-speed e-bikes upon any highways, streets, and roadways within our local government communities that are authorized for use by normal bicycles, including but not limited to bicycle lanes. With respect to streets and highways under its jurisdiction, local government is permitted to regulate the operation of e-bikes, and later in this presentation, I'll address a few of the regulatory frameworks other communities use concerning e-bikes. That includes, for now, registration and licensing requirements for such low-speed electric bicycles. This is very important. A community is preempted, so that means it cannot enact or enforce low-speed e-bike regulations that are inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code, unless that community is expressly authorized by the Vehicle Code to impose a certain regulation.
And Eugene, this is Kevin. I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. This is regardless of whether you're a home rule community, correct?
Correct. It applies to home rule and non-home rule municipalities. Excellent clarifying question.
Thank you.
So as an example here, because the Vehicle Code expressly authorizes people to operate e-bikes where normal bikes are allowed to operate, subject to certain restrictions, a local government cannot completely ban or prohibit people from operating e-bikes where normal bikes are allowed to operate. This stands in stark contrast to my colleague Tyler's presentation a little bit later, where a community can completely prohibit low-speed e-scooters within their communities. Now we plan to discuss some of the regulatory frameworks available to our communities, starting from the least restrictive options to the most restrictive options. State law does not require local governments to adopt e-bike regulations because there's existing laws applicable to e-bikes within the Illinois Vehicle Code. So if a community wanted to, you can just rely upon the existing regulations in state law and issue citations appropriately. Most communities have incorporated the Vehicle Code into their local municipal codes, but even if they have not, they can issue a citation pursuant to the applicable section of the Vehicle Code. So a community may simply choose to enforce existing state law. Most communities, yeah, I've already discussed that. By default, low-speed e-bikes are generally authorized to be operated upon any highway, street, or roadway that's authorized for use by normal bikes, subject to certain restrictions in the law. For example, all Class 3 e-bike operators must be at least 16 years old. That's one of the default requirements in the state law. The Vehicle Code's rules of the road that apply to bikes, normal bicycles that is, also generally apply to low-speed electric bicycles, including some of the requirements below that are non-exhaustive. For one, cyclists riding e-bikes must use a permanent and regular seat. People using low-speed e-bikes to carry more people than are prohibited from carrying more people on it than it for which the e-bike is designated and equipped. State law prohibits people from attaching e-bikes to any vehicle upon the roadway. We've seen a few TikToks or other social media sites where people are doing that, not particularly safe. State law also prohibits carrying any material or article while operating an e-bike, like your cell phone or a package. And e-bikes must be equipped with a lamp on the front with a red reflector on the rear that's visible from certain distances, and that's a safety requirement within the state law. Additionally, state law allows people to operate an e-bike upon any bicycle path within a municipality unless that municipality prohibits the use of e-bikes or a specific class of e-bike on a path. State law also prohibits the use of low-speed electric bicycles on sidewalks. And state law requires people to be 16 years old to operate Class 3 e-bikes. However, a marked absence within the state laws, there's no age restrictions to operate Class 1 and Class 2 e-bikes. Now to the moderately restrictive approach. Together with enforcing state law default rules for low-speed e-bikes, local government may further regulate unlicensed e-bikes. For example, citing one community, the village of Hinsdale, they require e-bike operators to complete and submit an application in order to receive a license and or a registration tag that authorizes the applicant to operate an e-bike. That community also charges applicants an application processing fee, a licensure fee, and or a registration fee. Some additional examples of regulations for e-bikes that communities have adopted include stickers. And for e-bikes, a community can require that there be a certificate of title, registration, and the applicant has a driver's license. And importantly, for low-speed e-scooters, they're expressly exempt from the operators of low-speed e-scooters do not need a certificate of title, registration, or driver's license to operate. Here, the most restrictive approach. A local government cannot completely ban e-bikes, as I briefly alluded to earlier in the presentation, because a person is authorized to operate them upon any highway, street, or roadway authorized for use by bicycles. This applies to home rule and non-home rule communities. Chapter 11 of the Illinois Vehicle Code is applicable and uniform throughout Illinois and all political subdivisions and municipalities therein. And no local authority can enact or enforce an ordinance, rule, or regulation in conflict with provisions of Chapter 11 unless there's an express exception authorizing them to do so. There's a similar language in 11-281 of the Vehicle Code. However, a local government may regulate e-bikes more stringently than state law in certain circumstances. For example, local government may regulate who can operate e-bikes, where the e-bikes can be operated, and impose other conditions on the operation of low-speed e-bikes. Importantly, when adopting low-speed e-bike regulations or amending existing regulations in our municipal codes, communities should remember to post appropriate signage along the trails or entries to public property when possible to promote compliance and enforcement. State law only requires operators of Class 3 e-bikes to be at least 16 years old. However, a community may, if it chooses to, prohibit any person from operating either a Class 1 or Class 2 or Class 3 e-bike in a community unless that person's at least 16. A community may also require a parent or legal guardian to co-sign a minor's application to use an e-bike and hold the minor's parents or guardian legally responsible for the minor's violations of the community's e-bike regulations. In accordance with state law, a community may also prohibit operating e-bikes or a specific class of e-bike on certain bicycle paths. Additionally, e-bikes are prohibited from being used upon any highway, street, or roadway where bikes are prohibited, that is, normal bicycles. E-bikes also cannot be operated upon a sidewalk, and a community may restrict e-bikes from operating on streets with high vehicular or pedestrian traffic for public safety reasons if normal bikes are also prohibited from operating upon those same areas. A community may also prohibit e-bikes from operating at a speed greater than reasonable and prudent under the then existing conditions, or from operating on any highway with a posted speed limit of 30 miles an hour or greater, for example. A community may also prohibit people from operating e-bikes in a reckless manner that may endanger or injure the operator or other people, property, or animals. With respect to safety requirements, as an example only, a community may require cyclists to walk their e-bikes in all areas where riding is prohibited. They can require cyclists to ride e-bikes single file in designated lanes. A community may restrict e-bike parking to specifically designated locations. For example, prohibit their parking in a commercial district within a municipality, or prohibit their operation if the operator is distracted, using their cell phone, or under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. So we discussed the regulatory framework for low-speed e-bikes from least to most restrictive. Here are prohibited e-bike regulations. State law, as we've discussed, prohibits a community from enacting or enforcing e-bike regulations that are inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code, which includes a community cannot completely ban them altogether. A community also cannot require Class 3 e-bikes, for example, to have a maximum speed of 20 miles an hour, because in this case, the definition for Class 3 e-bikes within state law authorizes them to operate up to 28 miles an hour. nor can a community require a Class 3 e-bike operator to be at least 18 because the state law authorizes operators to be 16. And regulation requiring them to be 18 would be an example of one inconsistent with Chapter 11 of the Vehicle Code. Tyler?
Thanks for providing that helpful overview of the regulatory options for e-bikes, Eugene. And now we'll be moving on to e-scooters, which we'll see shortly are very similar to kind of the regulatory options and scope for e-bikes. But there are some kind of different distinctions and twists for these type of vehicles. So as we saw with e-bikes earlier, there's the Vehicle Code provides for 3 different classifications. By contrast, the only definition for an e-scooter under the Vehicle Code is that of a low-speed electronic scooter, which the identifying characteristics is that the device weighs less than 100 pounds. It has between 2 to 3 wheels, handlebars, a floorboard that can be stood upon while riding by the operator. It can be powered exclusively by either an electronic motor or human power, and which maximum speed with or without human propulsion is no more than 10 miles per hour. And as anyone who has either ever used an e-scooter or seen one operated, these devices, most of the commercial devices available, go significantly faster than 10 miles per hour. But the state vehicle code's default rules under state law is that the operation of e-scooters within any municipality, park district, forest preserve district, conservation district, these are the most common units of local government where these vehicles are used, is allowed only if affirmatively authorized by such unit of local government. So in contrast to e-bikes, which Eugene just talked about a few minutes ago, those type of devices are by default allowed anywhere where bicycles are allowed to be operated. In contrast, e-scooters are only allowed when the governing body of local government, such as the municipality, park district, or forest preserve district, affirmatively authorizes the use of e-scooters in the community. Therefore, when a community has not authorized the use of e-scooters within it, either by an ordinance or a resolution, e-scooter use is prohibited. So anyone who is using an e-scooter device, whether it be on a sidewalk, roadway, private property within a community that has not allowed their use, would technically be in violation of the default rules. However, if a community elects to authorize the use of e-scooters, that community may regulate their operation on any or all highways within its jurisdiction, and this includes sidewalks, trails, and other public rights-of-way where bicycles are generally permitted to operate under the Vehicle Code. So then the next kind of question or focus here is, if your community does decide to allow e-scooters to be used, what options do you have to further regulate these vehicles, their use, and make sure that the use is safe for both the operators and other users of public spaces, whether that be pedestrians, bicyclists, people operating vehicles, to make sure that these are being used in a way that's safe and accessible for all members of a community. So as we saw with e-bikes, we've characterized these as the least moderate and most restrictive approaches. So under the least restrictive approach zone, a community does not have to adopt its own rules or regulations governing the use of e-scooters in a community. If a community decides that they want to affirmatively authorize the use of these vehicles, it can simply enforce the existing state law e-scooter requirements that exist under the Vehicle Code. So one way to do this would be for a community to either adopt these provisions of the Vehicle Code into the local municipal code or park district code by an ordinance or resolution. Alternatively, the enforcement could occur by just writing tickets to either in-house admin adjudication or circuit courts, traffic court under the existing Vehicle Code citations. And some of the existing state law requirements for the use of these vehicles is that even when e-scooters are allowed in a community, they are prohibited from being operated on a road that is a posted speed limit of greater than 35 miles per hour. Additionally, a person under the vehicle code is not allowed to operate an e-scooter unless they're at least 18 years old, which is something that probably does not occur or is not strictly enforced in practice. These vehicles are definitely favored by high school students as well. And then another rule is that a person may not operate an e-scooter while carrying a package or other item that prevents them from keeping at least one hand upon the handlebars. And that's very similar to one of the rules that Eugene mentioned for e-bikes, which is just meant to ensure that these vehicles are being operated safely and people aren't using them in a distracted or frustrated manner. E-scooters may not be operated to carry more than one person at a time. There's another kind of similar regulation we saw at e-bikes. And additionally, a person may not operate an e-scooter while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which would present a significant safety concern. And some additional rules that are under the default state vehicle codes for e-scooters, these rules relate more to the not the operation of the device, but more so about the safety features and maintenance of these. So if an e-scooter is being used at night, the vehicle must be equipped with sufficient minimum lighting on the front and rear of the e-scooter. This is obviously designed to help other pedestrians, bicyclists, or automobile drivers identify when one of these devices is on a space at night. An e-scooter must be equipped with a brake that will adequately control and stop the movement of the e-scooter. Another rule is that except for such devices being used as a police or fire department vehicles, an e-scooter cannot be equipped with a siren. A person operating an e-scooter may not attach themselves or the device to another vehicle being operated on the public right-of-way. We've seen a lot of examples of this type of use on TikTok and other social media platforms, and it almost always results in a wipeout, or if the operator is less fortunate, more serious injuries. A person is also prohibited from operating e-scooters on state highways. And then one kind of last, just general rule is that the e-scooter must be well maintained and in good operating condition, which would allow a ticket to be written through an enforcement mechanism if the brake isn't working or if the device is in disrepair and pieces are falling off. So that's kind of gives you an idea of what exists under the state law defaults if your community decides to allow these vehicles. Moving forward here, the next option is what we refer as the moderately restrictive approach. So this would entail that together with enforcing the state law default rules for these devices, a community can further regulate and license e-scooters pursuant to the vehicle code or as otherwise authorized by state law, provided that the regulations adopted under the moderately restrictive approach are consistent with the vehicle code's default rules. And we'll address that a little bit more in depth in a few slides in prohibited regulations. But if your community decides that they want to allow e-scooters, but take a little more of a stronger regulation and enforcement stance in the state law default rules, some examples of permissible regulations would be that you can, unlike bicycle e-bikes, which are allowed anywhere where the bicycles are operated, a community can more target and restrict where within the community that e-scooters are allowed to be used. So you can adopt the ordinance or resolution affirmatively allowing their use, but then you can restrict it within the community to areas where they're most appropriate. So you could prohibit e-scooters from being operated on certain roads, trails, sidewalks, or other rights-of-way where bicycles are prohibited. So if there's a very popular recreational trail, for example, in a park district or forest preserve district that's especially narrow and is heavily favored for like pedestrian walking or just recreational exercise, and your unit doesn't think it would be appropriate for e-scooters, you could restrict it from being operated on that recreation path, for example. You can prohibit persons under 18 years old from operating e-scooters as well. And in the context of a municipality could restrict the operation of e-scooters to specific zoning districts in the village. So, for example, they could be restricted to use in residential zoning districts and prohibited in downtown commercial business districts where there's more foot traffic, perhaps, and there's more vehicle traffic along certain roadways. An example of kind of a licensing or registration regulation would be that a community could require an e-scooter operator to submit an application in order to receive a license and or registration tag that authorize operating an e-scooter and charge applicants a processing fee, a license fee, and or registration fee to kind of recoup administrative costs in enforcing it. E-scooter parking can be restricted to specifically designated locations within a community or other unit of government. And as well, the community can impose reasonable speed restrictions on operating e-scooters. You can also adopt a regulation that prohibits an e-scooter operator from operating while either being distracted or under the influence. So the analogy here to the kind of common vehicle code rules would be either like distracted to be operating a cell phone with a hand. And additionally, under this approach, a minor's parents or legal guardian could be held responsible for the violations of an e-scooter regulation. And then I see a quick question in the chat here asking about what is defined as a state highway regarding the prohibition of use of e-scooters on state highways. And that would be the definition under the Illinois Highway Code and Illinois Vehicle Code, which they have a specific legal definition under that. But that would generally refer to state highways that are under the jurisdiction of IDOT, which wouldn't be like the streets in a residential neighborhood. It would be a more heavily trafficked, high-intensity roadway. And then some examples here of regulations that have been adopted under the moderately restrictive approach would be Oak Forest, which short of enacting a complete ban they allow persons to operate e-scooters on private property only. And then Frankfurt is one community that authorizes e-scooter use on private property, but only after the e-scooter operator has received the consent and permission of the private property owner. And additionally, under this approach, if a community does decide to allow e-scooter use and adopt regulations governing the use of these devices, it is advisable to post appropriate signage along the areas where e-scooters can't operate to promote compliance and enforcement. So under that example, if they're prohibited in a certain zoning district, it'd be appropriate to post signage along the entryways or the corridors, the pedestrian corridors into that district, advising users that the e-scooter use are prohibited. And then in a twist to kind of most regulations, the most restrictive approach, a complete ban, you would adopt this by simply doing nothing and not acting. Because as mentioned earlier, the Illinois Vehicle Code's default rule is that persons may not operate e-scooters unless the community has acted to affirmatively allow their use. So if you have to date taken no action to allow e-scooter use within your community, the state vehicle code's default rule applies, which that they are not allowed and their use is banned. So if your community does decide to regulate these vehicles and allow their use, there are some prohibited e-scooter regulations that you cannot adopt or enact. So for example, the state law prohibits enacting or enforcing e-scooter regulations that are inconsistent with those default rules we talked about earlier under Chapter 11 of the Illinois Vehicle Code. So for example, a person cannot affirmatively authorize persons younger than 18 to operate e-scooters because the vehicle code's default rule requires that an operator of such a device be at least 18 years aged or older. Additionally, because the vehicle code provides that e-scooters are not required to have a vehicle registration with the Illinois Secretary of State or certificate of title, and that a driver's license is not required to use these vehicles. If you were to adopt regulations along the moderately restrictive approach that we talked about, your community cannot require an operator to have a driver's license to use an e-scooter where they're allowed. They cannot require that the owner of an e-scooter have a registration or certificate of title issued by the Secretary of State, which would be required for some other type of devices, such as like motorcycles, cars, things that are commonly regulated with the Secretary of State. And moving forward to the most important part of any regulation is the enforcement aspect to ensure that the rules are actually being complied with. So if the community incorporates e-bikes and or e-scooter regulations that whether the default vehicle code rules we talked about in the municipal code, there are some different ways that you can go about enforcing it. For example, one way that's becoming more favored and preferred by communities is to write tickets under the municipal code citations for these vehicles to in-house administrative adjudication, which allows for ease of enforcement. Municipalities can recover more of the fines and the fees imposed through such tickets by not having to not having some of the money go to the circuit court costs. Alternatively, the existing default rules can also be enforced by police departments or park district police officers writing citations to traffic court calls, which is we've seen as well, which can have some effect in enforcement. No parent or no one likes going into circuit court on a business day, a work day, or a school day, so that does prevent a little bit of some misuse of these vehicles. And then one final thing that we're going to talk about today with the use of e-scooters and e-bikes is the liability considerations for the unit of government regulating these vehicles. In deciding whether to allow e-bikes and e-scooters on its property, a community, a municipality, a park district should be mindful of its general duty to exercise ordinary care to maintain its property in a reasonably safe condition for intended and permitted users of a property. Now, these are legal terms under the Illinois Tort Immunity Act, which requires that a municipality is generally liable for injuries that are suffered to someone who is an intended and permitted user of public property when the property is not maintained in a reasonably safe condition. And there's a long body of case law about this topic in the context of bicyclists, and when a bicyclist is found to be a permitted and intended users, that we'll talk about shortly here. But operators of e-bikes and e-scooters are generally understood to be permitted users of a road, a sidewalk, or a public right-of-way, unless there's an express prohibition stating otherwise. So, for example, here, if your community has not adopted an ordinance or resolution allowing e-scooter use, and is the default state vehicle code ban applies, any e-scooter operator will not be a permitted user of a roadway, a sidewalk, or other public right-of-way. However, if you have adopted regulations for e-scooters and e-bikes and they're understood to be permitted users, they're not necessarily intended users of a road without an express manifestation of the local authority's intent for the e-bike or e-scooter operator to be a intended user of that specific part of property. And in the chat, the question in the chat said that it would be helpful to discuss the court case regarding the Divvy bicyclists who sued the city of Chicago and lost the case because they were deemed to not be an intended user of the roadway. And that, of course, refers to the recent case that came out in 2023 of Alavi versus the city of Chicago, where a cyclist was riding a bike down a city of Chicago roadway, and 2 or 3 blocks before the pothole the cyclist struck and was injured, there was a divvy station on that roadway. So the cyclist argued that he was an intended and permitted user of that roadway because the city, by putting a divvy station there, was intending bicyclists to use that roadway. However, the cyclist lost that case, and the city of Chicago was not liable for their cyclist injuries because the court, in cumulatively looking at all of the factors of that roadway, found that because there was no signage no signage indicating that this road was intended for bike users, the city of Chicago's official bicyclist map did not designate that roadway as part of the bicycle lane street network. That cyclist was not an intended user of that specific roadway. The city was not liable for his injuries. So some ways that a community affirmatively expresses its intent to designate its roads as e-bike and or e-scooter routes is to allow and place affirmative manifestations on the roadway, such as signs or painted bike lanes, or if community has adopted a bike plan that clearly designates the roadways and public rights of way where all of that is done, that would be an example of where where a e-bike or e-scooter user is more likely to found to be both a permitted and intended user. And additionally, another aspect of regulating these vehicles is the considerations for under the Americans with Disabilities Act. All e-scooter and e-bike regulations that are adopted must comply with Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, commonly referred to as the ADA, which prohibits units of local government from excluding or denying benefits to people with disabilities who seek to participate in and access services, programs, or activities offered by local government units to the public at large. Some communities have undertaken regulation of these vehicles have provided an express exemption in the regulations for vehicles and equipment such as micro-mobility devices, which are necessary for individuals with disabilities as an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation to use public property. So just because an e-bike or an e-scooter regulation is adopted that either prohibit or heavily restrict the use of these vehicles, no regulation can just be blindly and strictly enforced. The American with Disabilities Act reasonable accommodation process is something that must be applied to these regulations as well. Since local governments are obligated to comply with the ADA, any regulations for these type of devices must be drafted in a sufficiently inclusive manner to allow for appropriate use of these mobility devices for people who are classified as disabled under the ADA and are eligible to take advantage of reasonable accommodations. So these type of regulations that we've been talking about for e-bikes and e-scooters do not apply to other types of vehicles and devices that, while may look and seem similar, are subject to separate regulations under the Illinois Vehicle Code. So, for example, some of these non-exhaustive list of vehicles and devices that are separately defined and regulated under the Vehicle Code are motor-driven cycles, low-speed vehicles, a low-speed gas bicycle, motor vehicles, which that would be your typical cars, motorcycles, which can be gas-powered or electric, but are very different in both like the size and speed capabilities of even a Class 3 e-bike, and mopeds as well, which, while look and seem similar to use of e-scooters, generally are faster and subject to their own separate, distinct regulations.
And notably, something that Dave brought up earlier in his presentation are the categories of e-motos that low-speed e-bikes and low-speed e-scooters do not fall into. These are the devices that are traveling sometimes in excess of 30, 35 miles an hour. The current regulatory framework in the vehicle code does not address these devices. And Tyler just kind of listed a few of the devices and vehicles which have separate regulations under the vehicle code. Part of the Illinois General Assembly's future hopeful comprehensive reevaluation will include regulations tailored to address some of these more high-speed electric devices, which is principally the evil that a lot of our local Illinois communities are seeking to remedy and regulate for the safety of their constituents.
Well, if I perhaps I'm the only one, but that was really easy to understand. That was
Thank you, Mayor.
So this underscores the complexity of this issue, does it not?
It does, and I saw a few questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There was quite a few, and I haven't had a chance to address all of them, but one of them asked, what are the best regulations you've seen addressing e-bikes and e-scooters? And we've drafted a few for our clients. We've seen others that are pretty good, but there's no one-fits-all answer because invariably the regulations that communities choose to adopt reflect the needs and fears of their constituents and the respective village boards and city councils. So they will invariably have to be tailored to what a community wants to do to regulate these devices.
And thank you for saying that magical sentence of the fears of local communities. Oftentimes, I think everyone on this call would agree that there are sometimes calls for regulations based on the attitudes of a few. And I think we all find ourselves in trouble when we govern in that regard. So Moving on to our friends of the Northwest Municipal Conference. Ready, folks?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Burns, and thank you, Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, for having us. We'll start sharing my screen here.
Delighted you're here. We got our friends Eric and Brian. Eric Chernata, right?
Yep.
Okay, Brian Larson. These guys are some of the world's leading experts on this topic, and we've flown them in at the courtesy of the Indiana Municipal League to help pay for these expenses. So welcome.
Thank you. All right.
You can roll your eyes if you want to. It's okay.
All right. Everyone seen the slides all right?
Sure do. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. We've been pretty closely involved in this issue for the greater part of about 6 months at this point. And really, just wanted to start off with kind of this slide showing that, this has been a major issue for municipalities throughout the region. These are just some of the news headlines that you might have seen throughout the summer and the fall. And really, as an organization, we saw a lot of these articles kind of get put out over the summer, and a lot of our members had started to put together different regulations regarding devices, which is why we kind of decided to put together an e-mobility summit on the subject that happened back in September. And this event really brought together local decision makers and industry experts to kind of share insights and ideas on how to kind of consider ordinances or not consider ordinances, kind of depending on regulating the different devices, e-bikes, e-scooters, and e-motos. And that discussion at the summit really kind of centered around the need to kind of develop clarity on specifically all of these different devices, but also kind of work at the state level to try to come up with some sort of remedy to the issue of just not really having conformity regarding these devices. And at the recommendation of the Northwest Municipal Conference Board, following this e-mobility summit, we formed a e-mobility working group on the subject. And this group consisted of local elected officials, municipal staff, city managers, law enforcement, legal attorneys, as well as advocacy groups on the subject. Additionally, the DuPage Mayors and Managers Conference was also involved, as were Representative Daniel Dittich and Representative Mary Beth Canty. And the work of this working group really consisted of kind of working on developing suggested legislative language to the Illinois Vehicle Code. And it really focused on three main kind of buckets within kind of the legislative process. And that was trying to provide a clear definition of e-mobility devices and based on classification and their capabilities. Additionally, identifying appropriate user age and or licensing, titling, or insurance requirements based on the device's capabilities. And finally, specifying specific locations where their use should be allowed or not allowed based on the device's capabilities. Additionally, we had also kind of taken a look at how tort immunity might be applied to some of these devices and as well as some sort of advertising kind of restrictions just to kind of restrict or try to limit, advertising high-powered devices, to children. And we had finalized the legislative language the first week of January, and it was submitted to the Legislative Reference Bureau by Representative Dittich on behalf of the group. But I also want to mention that we had also met with the Secretary of State's office as well throughout this process, and this is an issue that they are also closely monitoring as well. And additionally, the Secretary of State's office is also working on their own suggested language that they're going to be submitting to the Legislative Reference Bureau that's going to be championed by Senator Villavelam and Representative Hernandez. We did have a chance to kind of take a look at that legislative language as well, and it's very similar to the language that we had been working on as well, with some very slight differences here and there, but that is to be expected when two different groups are kind of working on on language such as that. So I do know that we were asked to kind of mention what's on the horizon currently for, I guess, in Springfield regarding these devices. And currently it is a little murky and unclear, especially since the language was just submitted in the past couple weeks. However, obviously the Secretary of State's office did mention that this is a priority for them this year, and this is something they're closely monitoring. So there's a very decent chance that something is going to happen in Springfield, but at the current moment, we don't really have too much to share on exactly what will be happening in Springfield. But we will continue working with the Secretary of State's office and the Legislative Reference Bureau and Representative Dittidge's staff to try to address these issues. But now I want to pass it over to my colleague Brian Larson, who will really be showing why kind of gaining consensus on this issue and kind of having a unified consensus on this issue is so important. So take it away, Brian.
Thanks so much, Chair. Yeah, so one reason that we wanted to bring this to, and why our members especially were interested in diving into this issue, was the wide variety of approaches that communities were taking to regulating devices. To assist our panels in their discussion, we developed a series of maps that showcased how the communities across the region were approaching 3 categories of devices: e-scooters, e-bicycles, and e-motos. So here on the e-scooter slide, you can see that there is already a variety of different ways that communities were taking the regulation of those devices. We simplified the categorization of regulations down to 4 primary categories. Ones that required a driver's license for use of devices, ones that allowed for a lower age minimum than the statutory than the vehicle code provided, ones that provided bike path prohibitions from being able for e-scooter devices to be able to utilize those paths, as well as communities that had passed complete bans on use of those devices. And as you can see, while regionally it seems the most regulations are in the northern Cook, southeastern Lake County area, they widely vary between just a couple miles here and there. So that was one reason why we were looking at this subject. Then onto the issue of e-motos, we saw a similar division in terms of how communities were approaching these devices. However, it generally fell onto one of 2 approaches. One, either communities enacted an outright ban, not allowing devices, not allowing any of the e-moto type devices on their public roadways, on their bike paths, etc. The other approach that we saw amongst communities that enacted regulations were ones where they were allowing usage of the devices by 16 years of age or older, but you had to have a driver's license as part of the requirements to be able to utilize. Alongside those kinds of regulations, we saw generally them also restricting those devices from utilizing the bike path. So prohibiting the higher speed capable devices from using routes that were maybe considered recreational or for travel purposes, or for lower speed travel purposes. Sorry. And then for e-bikes, we saw, again, a variety of regulations. Here, there were actually a few more required regulations that we saw, including prohibitions from certain kinds of roads. This goes to what the prior speakers had mentioned about the prohibition of roads that have a speed limit of 35 miles per hour or more. But again, we saw similar restrictions as in the prior 2 categories. Age minimums being put into place. In that case, we saw restrictions ranging from 14 years of age to 18 years of age, with many communities landing on 16 years of age and then often requiring 18 years of age for the Class 3 e-bikes. We also saw a variety of communities establishing prohibitions from bike paths, as well as requiring driver's licenses. And in a couple communities, there were also complete bans on any motorized device. So when laying the groundwork for the discussion, one of the items of concern amongst our presenters and members was the issue of interregional travel. The NWMC developed a multimodal transportation plan, which established a series of priority regional bike corridors to allow for easier active transportation throughout our member communities and the overall region. This is relevant to our members because under the current state law, class 1, 2, and 3 e-bikes are defined by the law as bicycles and vulnerable road users. And so depending on the scope of restrictions that could be put into place, these type of users could face mobility limitations because of their inability to maintain the same speeds as experienced on higher speed limit roadways. So at the time of that summit, we highlighted where, if there were any restrictions put into place on a broad regional front, this is not by municipality or municipality, this is by the type of segments in our priority network, where class 1, 2, and 3 e-bicycles could be potentially restricted. As you can see, what used to be a broad regional network is now fragmented. The areas in red are off-street routes, so bike paths or side paths, where if there was a restriction for those devices, would definitely be prohibited from operating. Additionally, we have a lot of segments that are still in the planning phase. And so while communities have not yet decided whether or not these may or may not be on or off street paths, in the general development that we've seen by our communities, most tend towards a off-street network to supplement their existing system. So those could also see prohibition from those uses. Therefore, it would generally limit to only a couple of complete routes where there would be on-street availability of you to be able to utilize the class 1, 2, and 3 devices. So with this in mind, this was what sort of formulated putting together the summit and also our working group, because one thing that the members did not want to see was a fragmentation of going from one community to another and then experiencing a completely new regulatory framework. And just due to the different needs of users and how close together some of our communities can be, that would create a significant change and burden of knowing what the laws are within just a small area for regular residents and users of the system. And that was generally what we were seeing amongst the membership, and happy to share this with you all and answer any questions.
Now, Brian, is it true that your executive director, Mark Fowler, actually rode those routes that you showed on his e-scooter?
As far as I know, and Mark can probably attest better to it than I, he does not actually own an e-scooter, but that would be quite an endeavor to manage all of those miles, I would say.
Indeed. So, well, we have some time for questions, and my suspicion is there are tons of questions. But if I may just kick it off, am I incorrect that every municipality in Illinois, by almost automatic, adopts the Illinois Vehicle Code in order for their police officers to operate within their jurisdictions?
Almost unilaterally, Kevin. I've seen only a few examples where they don't expressly incorporate the IVC. They don't have to, because if there's an applicable violation of state law, you can always cite someone and the ticket can be sent to circuit court, but almost universally, yes.
Got it. So it stands to reason, just adopt the IVC and call it a day if you want the least restrictive.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much. Who else? Edith and Shirley, is something pressing in the chat? That's all pressing, of course, but.
Yeah, and I want to thank the speakers very much for not only incredible presentations, but also for staying on top of the chat. There may be some questions that are outstanding, so I'm going to ask the asker if that was sufficiently answered. So Trustee Lawrence, you had a question that I don't think has been addressed yet. That had to do with, I guess, enforcement. Do you want to speak up or raise your hand? And
so my question was not answered. I'm concerned about liability to a municipality, and I realize that government entities are uniquely protected, but in general, if residents are witnessing infractions and they also witness an officer nearby, are we in a unique position of vulnerability if an officer doesn't at least get up and go speak with, and typically, yes, it's a child, and often there are two on a bike and one is on their phone and, they're goofing around, and it's scary to the residents who are speaking up to me.
Trustee, you and I must have a party line, because those are the calls I get as well. It's, why aren't our cops doing something about these damn kids who are hanging out in these things and this, that? Yeah, it's I don't know how to answer that question other than in Geneva, we have 4 officers on patrol at any one time, and we have 110 miles of roadway. And
I will not provide probably a satisfactory answer. I will say that generally, as local government attorneys, we advise our clients to ensure consistent enforcement of its local laws as well as applicable state or federal law. If somebody happens to witness a violation of local or state law and it's not being enforced, you're encouraged to contact your local village board or council members, contact the mayor, show up a public comment, voice your concerns, and highlight your perceived importance of consistent enforcement of these regulations.
that sounded very lawyerly. Well done, man.
Thank you.
I'll elevate another pair of questions and see if that feels like those were addressed. So there were questions raised by or comments made both by Elizabeth Wiseman and Randy Faust related to accessibility. Elizabeth raised concerns about prohibitions and being unfair or excluding those with limited mobility or seniors. And then Randy Faust also raised a similar question, and that while it was addressed in the ADA conversation, I wonder if we want to go back to visit that conversation, or if either any of the speakers or Randy or Elizabeth want to elevate that discussion. Sounded complicated to me.
To me, Edith, for what it's worth, I'll kick things off, but if I'm walking downtown Geneva, which happens to be at the intersection of a state-owned highway and a local road, and there's somebody cruising around on a e-bike or e-scooter, yet there's also someone cruising around respectfully on a mobility device because of their disability, I think most people would say the individual with the disability is allowed to, just by right, via the ADA. The other two knuckleheads knock it off. But that's...
I'll say from a legal perspective that mobility devices for ADA purposes do not fit within the definition of low-speed e-bikes and e-scooters. So they're by law excluded from that. And most communities that we advise actually include language within their ordinances saying that there's an express exemption for the applicability of those laws to micromobility devices for ADA purposes.
Hi, I'm Rudy.
Rudy, sorry.
Okay. Just to clarify my question, I think I was going off of the Parks Department. It wasn't, this gets into an identifiable. This is not for the single track e-bikes. This is more seniors and other people who use e-bikes as a mobility device that's not identifiable. This gets really tricky because then it's like, are you going to stop and ask if people are ADA? I think that in itself becomes an issue. So plenty of people, low vision drivers use e-bikes who can't drive. This is Anna Zivart's book. I'd recommend that on this. So what of those people getting to destinations if they're zoned out of going to business destinations and institutional destinations? How do we do that? And the intended routes aren't clear.
It's a great question. To my attorney friends, does that require then that municipalities should when they pass permissive legislation, also then increase signage that says these types of vehicles for accessibility are permitted outright?
I would, and if someone's relatively low vision, how are those signages visible to those people?
And I think the signage is equally as important for those who aren't, simply to understand that the sidewalk is usable by multiple different constituents. But I agree with you. I'm trying to find a common ground too. It's interesting.
Generally, under the ADA, in order to receive in a reasonable accommodation, there's an interactive process where the person who is classified or characterized as disabled for the purposes of the act is reaching out to the appropriate local government or governmental body to request a reasonable accommodation. And then the and then the governmental body will work with the applicant to determine the exact scope and what will be a reasonable accommodation. So the community will know which individuals have reached out to request the reasonable accommodation, and then they could determine the appropriate course of action that may be allowing that individual to operate a device where it might otherwise be prohibited. And in that instance, if that was to be the determination of what is going to be the reasonable accommodation itself, they could notify enforcement personnel of that, where if they were stopped and pulled over, for example, the police department might have a list, or they might know, because it won't be a high number, likely will not be a high number of people who are requesting this as a reasonable accommodation. And just because someone is requesting to use an e-bike or an e-scooter in a manner or area that might be prohibited, just because they make the request and might qualify as being a disabled individual under the act, the governmental body is not by right or by law required to automatically grant or approve all reasonable accommodation requests. So, for example, they might find that the use of some other micromobility or e-mobility device that has a different classification and definition under the vehicle code is a more appropriate, reasonable accommodation for access to public spaces and public areas. And those type of devices, as I believe Eugene and I mentioned earlier in our presentation, don't fall within the vehicle code's definition of e-bikes and e-scooters.
Yeah, that's part of the interactive
I need
process.
I need lead time then if I want to go to another jurisdiction, then if I'm mobility. Anyway, sorry, I'll leave it at that.
We have about 5 or 6 minutes left, folks, and forgive me for skipping over a couple issues here. Our current speakers, Brian and Eric. I want to share with all of you something pretty cool about our friend Eric Chernata. This guy has actually utilized the largest bicycle garage in Utrecht, Netherlands, a 3-story underground garage that can hold a record 13,500 bicycles, which begs the question, Eric, what the hell are you doing in the Netherlands?
My sister was actually studying at the University of Utrecht there, so I was visiting her.
That is so cool, man. And it was easy to find your bicycle. I assume it was the Schwinn with the banana seat.
Yep.
That's for the older people in the crowd, by the way. And Brian, I understand that you are spearheading and the founder of your child's Bike and Roll to School Day.
That's correct. 3 years, and actually it will be the 4th year this May. So we've seen attendance and participation double since we kicked it off.
I bet you have it. Now, I also understand that you actually drive in your car and everybody else follows you. Is that accurate or no?
Well, so it's a daycare, so we bike in and everybody bikes in for the little party there.
I know, I'm teasing. There's cocktails at the elementary school or no?
I wish, but you know.
Additional questions before we sign off, folks?
I'd like to call on Sarah, who's had her hand raised.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for the very thoughtful presentations. I'm wondering if there's someone here who can clarify what really is the plan at the state level. It seems very clear to me that this really does need to be resolved in a very comprehensive way. Like I did hear mention, perhaps it was Dave, mentioning that there's a couple different bills coming at the state level, and it just seems like there's already a lot of dissonance between existing policy. For example, we have folks needing to be 18 years old to ride a low-speed e-scooter that goes 10 miles per hour, but can be 16 years old and ride a multi-ton vehicle that goes well over 100 miles per hour at top speed. So there's a lot of inconsistency right now, and also our networks are regional. So even this idea that we can have different municipalities that are a few miles in square area having different codes from one another, I just think it's a very car-centric way of thinking, where we're saying, okay, state law is going to be regulating cars and car usage so that you can, without looking up people's codes, travel regionally and beyond. But for a small vehicle that you might rely on because it's less expensive, it's more sustainable, you need to memorize the codes of 160 municipalities and not know whether you're even allowed to do it, versus actually just having regulations that make these things safe and clarify them in a comprehensive way. So do we have clarity on what is going to be the next step at the state level? Because it seems very clear that that is needed.
I will just quickly say that was a very accurate description of the existing state vehicle code definitions and regulations. They're very inconsistent and sometimes almost contradictory between the e-bikes and the e-scooters. And someone could be riding an e-bike in their community and going to either a grocery store or other store or purpose in the next community over, which could be the next block in some instances, and all of a sudden be pulled over and ticketed. So there is some definite need for comprehensive statewide legislation to address this issue in a comprehensive manner, which I think Dave and Eric are kind of leading that effort or are involved in that effort.
If I can follow on to that, almost closing like comments about the inconsistency, is there any advice either for the municipalities on this call to stay further engaged or to participate in something that is more unified across the region, or if there's anything the caucus can do? We really greatly appreciate the leadership of Northwest Municipal Conference on this, and we really appreciate learning from them. Glad to see DuPage Mayors and Managers Conference is also participating, but is there anything else further that would help advance the legislation that's fair and supports municipalities and gets to a little bit more consistency across the region?
Yeah, at the current moment, we're really just kind of waiting to hear back from the Legislative Reference Bureau and also from Representative Dittich to kind of see if they have any kind of comments back regarding that. But we're happy to keep the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus in the loop as well when we kind of hear back and kind of hear what the next steps might be.
So Dittich, Hernandez, Villabalum, these are the men
and Mary Beth Canty.
And Mary Beth Canty, yeah, okay. Can I drop your name, Eric?
You can, but it might not hold the same weight as some of those other names.
Our next meeting, folks, is February 17th. We're discussing CRJA, the Clean, Reliable Grid Act, and how it impacts local communities. And also, I believe in the chat, Edith and Cheryl, there's a reference to seeking volunteers to speak to our Northern Illinois University students regarding the Greenest Region Compact. We would love to have as many community representatives join us in engaging our university students. Anything I forgot for anyone, or any pressing question to answer before we sign off?
Just a reminder that we do keep slides and the recording to the Environment and Energy Committee meetings on our Environment and Energy Committee page. So if you didn't take very good notes on some of the excellent presentations, the slides will be available for your reference in a day or two. So thank you so much.
Yes, thanks everybody. Enjoy your day.
Tremendous expertise.
Cool. Yeah, stay cool. What the hell? Stay warm. Be careful out there. Enjoy the sun. Have a safe week.